Hey, I'd like to welcome you to week 10 of BIM 1040, Project Definition and Deliverables. So what we're going to do, this is the virtual recording of the class, canceled due to labor stoppage. We'll do a quick review of where we've come to. Last week we were talking about legal. We're going to continue that on into project delivery. Now, remember, all of this is within the context of defining what's required for a BIM project, both your definition and deliverables. So defining what you're BIMing and why you're BIMing it and what you have to deliver. To define all of that, you need to have a fundamental understanding of what BIM is, the client requirements, your execution plan. So this is the BIM Bible. This is how we're going to achieve the goals we set out on the project, where you document those goals. You document the BIM uses, which we're going to expand upon next week in week 11. And we're going to document software, any hardware, any workflows, use workflows, which we'll talk about next week. LOD matrix, who's modeling what and when. And that's the most critical thing coupled into the legal and the project delivery. Who's modeling what and when. And everybody seems to forget the and when portion. Talked about software. So again, what software does the client use? What software do the consultants use? The contractors, do they talk to each other? Is there software of familiarity versus software of requirements, and how do they all gel together? How do you share all this stuff? Are we sharing model, data, CAD? Are we sharing live models, stuff fit for sharing, stuff that's only published? Is it just for the design team, for the design and contractors? Does it include the owners? Is it throughout the life cycle? Is it just during design? All questions, all influence how we collaborate. What are our BIM uses? So coupling back now to the BIM execution plan, we've defined the goals, we've defined the uses to achieve the goals. The question then is, what are those uses that are available to us that we can then infuse to either enrich our project, enrich our goals, or just enhance the way we work? Deliverable requirements. So hopefully some of those are coming from the employer's information requirements or the client requirements. Sometimes it may range from CAD data to BIM data. It may be just PDFs. It may be requirements to deliver to the owner, to the contractor, to other consultants. All of that has to be understood. We defined the technical solution. So we talked about what does that mean, then pulling everything together, looking at all the particulars of what you might have to model. Are you doing analytical work? Are you doing quantities? Is there schedule simulation? Are you doing it? Are you required to feed someone else to do it? And how does that all come together? Then we got into legal. So once we defined everything, then we pulled back and we said, great, well, while we're doing it, what is the barrier that prevents us from actually achieving it? So everybody seems to have the right desires so often, but then we have issues that prevent us from actually achieving it or making it real. So the legal aspects last week, we talked about, as an architect or an engineer, what are those barriers that prevent us or restrict us or make us stand back and say, no, we're not going to do BIM? What makes us say that? So we talked about professional liability, fear of negligence. We talked about initially the concept of the limit of liability. We talked about the BIM contract appendix. So oftentimes it's very difficult when we agree there's going to be technology or technological solutions applied, but that's done after contracts are done. So all of a sudden, we all have this expectation bound by a standard contract client or client consultant agreement saying we're going to do certain things. And then there's a little note that says, yeah, and once the BIM execution plan is made, that will define more. Well, that'll have implications on, once I've always said, scope, schedule, budget. And with those implications come the fear and resistance if there isn't proper compensation and planning. So the contract, and using the architect's contract as an example, now has a clause, the most recent RAIC form, saying that if there is BIM applied on a project, use the BIM appendix. And there's now a BIM appendix that takes some base fundamentals that are expanded upon an execution plan and puts them embedded into the contract. You will model, you will share the model, and you will use the model for these specific purposes. In the contract, understood, priced, and agreed upon. Therefore, anything in addition is in addition, anything not is in scope, and we all comply. The other thing it did is it talks about a little bit of risk mitigation. So if we're sharing the model and it's being harnessed for purposes other than what was planned, that's fine. It's all with the concept of use at your own risk. So with that, going into week 10, I called it legal and contracts continued. What I was hoping on the hybrid, so the online portion, the individual, was just to talk about concerns and how we would mitigate them. And it was really to get you, the students, to come to the table with some ideas of what you either have seen or you could imagine would constitute concerns to avoid doing BIM under the guise of professional liability. So a couple of examples there. As an architect, I can look back to my experience and I'll say, fear of being sued, fear of being negligent. And that's a little misplaced, but what that's rooted in is I give digital data to someone else in tort law, so not contract law, but tort law, where I, as an architect, am expected to have a duty of care over my goods and services. So I give you data. Am I not responsible for that data? So if I tell you something and you go and either price or build or dig, what if I gave you information in a model, you assumed it was correct, maybe the geospatial, the latitude, longitude, or the geospatial coordinates was wrong on the model, and you sent out a machine GPS controlled excavator, so machine controlled excavation. You started to dig a hole, you assumed it was in the spot I stated, but it ends up being somewhere else. You break a gas line, maybe somebody gets personally injured. Am I liable? So that's a big fear that resonates globally throughout the industry relative to this turnover of information. I've talked previously about the world of perpetually connected data. So imagine how immense this becomes, where if all the information is connected and talking, where is my duty? Where is the line of my duty of care? So that's a fear, and that's why today's class, we are going to talk about limit of liability. So that's a big, big piece. Another concern would be accuracy of other data. So you're giving me information upon which I'm supposed to do my design, and I have to assume that data is accurate. Fear of data currency. So do I always have the most current data? Is the information being reflected of current states of decision-making, current states on the design build, what's been constructed versus what's being designed? Then there's questions of other concerns as an architect. See, it's tough for me sometimes because I've been living and breathing BIM for what seems like a lifetime now. But from condition assessment and existing condition, a big fear is you're going to put all of this effort into the technological solution. How valid and accurate is your existing data? And how well can it be trusted? And this kind of resonates back for decades upon decades. How accurate is my survey? Should we get a new survey? What if the client doesn't want to pay for new surveys? What do I do? Do I base my design on a survey that could be inaccurate? And that was the 2D survey with Northings and Eastings. Now, existing conditions modeling, existing BIM models, turned over data, does it represent the as-built, does it represent the assets that are there? What about change in conditions during construction, et cetera? And now I'm supposed to do a design? So a lot of those questions, the analytical as an engineer, How well do I trust the information or the outputs of the analysis by third-party softwares? And how do I know that it meets the codes and standards and that I expect them to? And thus my duty of care as an engineer relative to lighting analysis, structural analysis, pipe stress analysis, how do I know that that is maintained based on software I have not written, therefore based on calculations I am not doing manually? A lot of dialogue, right? And again, sometimes it's faith and trust and experience. And we've for mitigation, we would say, let's budget in. You do your calculations, then you press the buttons on the software, see how close they are. I've seen that for estimates as well. The other liability concern is, well, how do I trust that people are not just fudging things with the software that will then come and prove themselves to fruition later on? And mitigation could be, diligence with relative to implementation, diligence of BIM coordinators, ensuring things are done accurately. So this was the gist of the dialogue I would have hoped to have had live with the students. And it really is just to get the thinking around, what are these items? What are these fears? We're going to get into modes of project delivery and integrated project delivery, and really, in essence, project delivery fundamentals is what we're going to talk about today. And that's a concern, because whether I'm doing BIM or not doing BIM, adhering to fundamentals of project delivery is where most projects fail, period. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. And then we'll close with looking at the limit of liability sheet and talking it through that just a bit. So remember last week we said, sometimes they'll come to usually to the BIM coordinator to work through the IBC contract appendix. Similarly, they'll come to us to work through a limit of liability to make sure that it's valid and viable. But first today, talking about fundamentals of project delivery. This is a slideshow that's offered inside IBI Group, and I've infused a couple of BIM slides that you've already seen. And it's very important, in my opinion. So I think this is now the 6th time or more that I've showed this slide. So hence, to stress the importance of it, BIM does not work outside of project delivery, nor can it as a process be applied void of an understanding of project delivery. And oftentimes it's these first two. Is it design, bid, build, or is it a design build? So thus, is the architect and the contractor contracted to the owner with implied contractual relationships between the architect and the contractor? Very tough arrangement. Is it design build, where the architect is working for the contractor, who in turn is working for the owner? Very different situation. And the beauty of design build, call it temporal fusion, whatever you want. It's not you design it and then you build it. You design, and while I design, it's getting built part of it. And while it's getting built, the as-built feeds back to the design to further the design. And it's an insane cycle over and over and over again. Design build has led into the P3, which is public-private partnership. Usually there's arrangements between the owner, public entities, and private firms, all working together in order to achieve public-based contracts like major transit projects, major works like hospitals, etc. Coming far more common. Again, it's design build with far more arrangements, usually also involving some element of the owner operation, all infused together. That leads to the lesser used integrated project delivery. Now there's an awesome book that I'm in the process of going through, and it just talks about IDP, much newer to North America, but it's conceptually sound from the BIM perspective. Everybody's on the table, architect, engineer, owner, contractor, all working together, ensuring costs are covered, splitting profit, sharing risk, removing the finger pointing, and ensuring that the best for the project is occurring. Fundamentally sound, especially from a BIM perspective. Imagine then data is flowing, we're all working together to ensure that the most optimum output or outcome is being focused on to be achieved. With all of these, it is completely, in my opinion, it's irrelevant which one of these you have if you're not following fundamental aspects of project management. So I'm going to talk about that here, because as a BIM coordinator, we're not the project managers. We don't have direct responsibility, but we'll have a strong influence on all these pieces. And if we don't, that's when often we see challenges. So I'll take you through this. I'll skip through IBI particulars. This slide came from the Project Management Institute, and I love it. So a quick example, this is how project management fails. How the customer explained what they wanted. How the project leader understood. How it got analyzed and designed. So you can see there, simple clash, right? How the programmer thought about it. The business consultant described it. What was documented, and that's scary because that's actually in reality. Nobody knows what was actually done in the real world. We have trillions upon trillions of dollars of built infrastructure with no documentation. What was initially installed, how the customer was billed, often the case. Why did it pay for so much for something that seemed so simple? How it was supported, and what was really needed. Great example of broken communication, lack of documentation, lack of defined scope, lack of outlined schedule, messed up budgets, all crazy. So, got to understand the client needs. So again, as we go through this, think about how it relates back to everything we've done from the BIM coordinator perspective. The second class we did, understanding client needs. The fundamental piece to anything inside the AEC industry. We have to plan, communicate, manage change, evaluate, and resolve any of the issues. All of this can be applied to project management as a whole. The BIM coordinator can be conceptually conceived of a subset of project management, focusing on the BIM aspects. Therefore, everything described here directly applies to the application of the BIM coordinator role on a project as well. This was a slide presented to us internally, and I love this concept. We can't win unless we do everything. Business development, get a contract, do the work and bill, and then collect. Now, in order to do that, picture those first two. We can't just go off and do BIM without knowing what we're BIMing, why we're BIMing it, making sure it's embedded into the contract through the BIM execution plan, maybe the IBC BIM contract appendix, make sure all parties agree to the process, all parties understand the deliverable, the software, the collaboration, what uses are being done, what our project goals are to meet the client's needs. Notice I just went straight back through the last 8 weeks of our course. All of those pieces are critical in order to achieve the outcome as defined for the project. We can't do it. We won't have the work. We won't be able to bill. Won't collect cash. All the BIM myths will start to riddle back in. BIM is expensive. BIM is useless. BIM is not you. All that stuff. Very important in project delivery. Managing risk comes together with project delivery. Couple things to dwell on here. Inexperienced project manager and an inexperienced PM would be ones that don't engage BIM consultants. Unqualified staff. Hey, so-and-so, lead the BIM. I've never done BIM before. Oh, that's okay, just lead it. Horrible. Technical errors and omissions, that could be very broad. But think about that. Scope management. What are we BIMing and why are we BIMing it? That's an element of the project's scope. Often forgotten, which is why there's so much effort trying to get us at the forefront of when we're starting these projects. So a couple like advices here on how to mitigate risk. Always have a written contract. Now, this is, again, when this is the audience, this is a project manager, that's a formal contract. But think about what we talked about last week. There many agencies or jurisdictions around the globe are looking to have formal BIM contract appendices. A contract appendix is part of a formal written contract. And they're doing that because too often the contract says, we'll agree to a BIM execution plan at a later date. So now they're trying to infuse fundamentals as part of the written contract. Provisions for dispute resolution. So there's, and again, that's a very broad range from a project management, but think about how that applies in the BIM world. If we have the contract, and if you're in the midst as a BIM coordinator saying, well, now we want to add the quantification, cost estimation, BIM use, we want quantities from your model now. Your model is not giving me good quantities. How do we deal with that? How do we accept it? So I think we'll leave it at that. All of these are important, but again, I'm trying to deliver this within the confines of the BIM world. Signing without proper authorization, building a budget, making sure the right skill sets are there, and then not updating your budget and revising as you find more. So think about those items to keep a project properly going forward. Oftentimes, you know, we talk about scope creep, we talk about not knowing what we're doing and why. The BIM coordinators, I press them very heavily to be cognizant of their budget. You need an idea, and oftentimes we can get a starting point, but if you write a BIM execution plan and then you see you're just doing a whole bunch of different things that you did not expect, don't just go into a void and do them. Have the dialogue with the project. Maybe you're doing work that was expected to be done by designers, by the project modeling team, but it's being thrown to the BIM coordinators. And that's a good, building your budget without confirming staff requirements. That's a big problem, because if you find out you have a team that's very bad at Revit, all new Revit people, you might find yourself making more content than normally you would. And that puts a burden on your scheduling and your budgeting. Keep a happy client, that's an important one too. So this project management model that we talk about in IBI, we have the BD phase, we try to win the work, then we initiate, we plan, we execute, we close. Kind of, very typical. I don't know if this is really appropriate, just the IBI process. Well, this is what we deliver to our project managers. And within it, I know I have the triangle. I've talked about the scope, schedule, budget triangle. And then the whole thing, we have to manage our budget, our scope, our resources, keep invoicing, and mitigate risk. So it's very important. I'll bring all of these up. In each phase, there are specific things that are done from a PM perspective. But critical, and this gets lost a bit, identify and assess the opportunity. At that stage, I've pressed very heavily, BIM coordinators should be engaged, and not full-time, but just to have the dialogue. Hey, we're about to try to win a project. This type of client, this type of building, this type of arrangement. Is it design build? Is it design bid? We're thinking of modeling, but we're going to bid it using our global offices. At least you can come in there and say, yep, make sure you account for how to share the models, engagement of in most, if not all, of these phases. And that's what we're going to talk a bit about. We're going to go through each of these phases here briefly. And just, again, I understand that these are catered towards project managers, but imagine the implementation portion required from the BIM perspective. So looking at these pieces, we're going to go through each one of these quickly. A market plan, this isn't IBI specific, so I'm not going to dwell on this, but basically this looks at the work, the forecasted work, the revenue we're going to bring in. who's going to account for the amount of resources required for this project. Talking about, taking into account the addition of potential sub-consultants, etc. Committed work, we declare that the work that we have on hand versus the work we think we could get probably versus possible work that we're looking at down the road. So we internally look at our opportunities and we have a formal tracking mechanism. So from the BIM side, I'm able to analyze these and see, hey, if we have work that's looking probable, can I go and start to engage in a BIM dialogue? Have we committed to work and not yet looked at whether there are any specific client requirements or needs? So it's a good way to quickly go and assess, and then to help determine, is it a go, no go? So oftentimes this is based on increased liability or decreased limits of liability, higher risk projects or higher prices. But from a BIM perspective, it allows me to go in and, potentially, sometimes we see BIM projects, go scan our existing, and we'll go and see what it's about, if there's any heavy degree of analysis, or whether it's a simple technological project. It allows me to help feed project managers to say, hey, look, from a technological aspect, there isn't anything concerning, or there is, and it may increase the risk, and it may help to feed whether we proceed or not proceed. I'm going to skip this. This is a IBI slide, really. This is important. So inside the business development phase, a lot of work is done. Like, we're trying to win the project. So to win the project, we have to propose a fee. In order to propose a fee, we need to have first of all, the BIM coordinator role, or the role of BIM management, has to be thought of and understood. And I always say, especially internally, if it's a, quote, simple project with simple BIM uses, design authoring, design review, and visualizing, I'll ask, is there advanced visualization? Do we have to do regimented clash detections? I'll quickly ask, is it an IBI team, or is it IBI plus externals? Then it kicks in potentials for collaboration. I ask if there's any software needs. And then I can quickly say, yeah, there could be a bit of a burden. We might need 2 hours a week on average. Let's just plan for that. Or no, it might just be a setup and the team can go off and we'll just poke in and see. It allows me to very quickly get them a concept so that there can be a line item, help them in their resource plan, and help them really get a price back to the client that accounts for the management of BIM at the very beginning. Remember, project definition and deliverables. It doesn't get any more important from the definition perspective than it does right here when we're trying to win the project. And the worst case is, if we win the project, then we come back and discover there's a huge BIM management component that was not accounted for, and that then requires additional or excessive fees to be applied. Very important. Also, it's important to understand, have the dialogue about different contractual prices as well. If it's a lump sum contract, that just means come the end of the project, you're paid X. So what does that mean? If we don't account for the BIM management at the beginning, and we say, oh no, we need it after, sure, we're just eating into the profits, eating into the firm's bottom line. So we have to understand that. Cost plus means there's no amount stated. So it's an estimate at the beginning, and then it can change and adjust. And then if there's an increase, we can, understand that increase and have that dialogue. So there's a little bit more leeway in the change, but, lump sum is very, very common. Earned value means we'll look at the progress of a project, and we understand based on the progress over time, how much value we're creating based on what's been completed. Often as a BIM coordinator, you're asked, how much budget have you expended and how complete are you? And sometimes that's tough, but you look and say, well, we're at the beginning of the project, we've set up the project, here's the execution plan. For the first phase of the project, I'm 80% complete, and my budget is, 70% spent. This is my earned value, and we can calculate that. Budget variance, how much more have you spent? How much less have you spent? Spend less, probably better. Unless you're on time and material, then it's kind of irrelevant. And then the effort is the effort it takes to do the work. So some fundamentals that it requires, that's really good for us to understand. And then if we lose the project, or if we do not win, then we conduct a lesson learned and we look back. And I've been on those where they say, well, Brent, the BIM number was high. Well, this is the assumptions that were made, and we try to mitigate maybe the rate that we use, or maybe it calls for clarity, or maybe it calls us, it raises the point that we should ask questions during these bids. So oftentimes in those RFPs, like we looked at a couple of weeks ago, you search BIM, it says something, you make some assumptions, and you price it. Well, there are windows to ask questions, and sometimes it's good to do that too. So that's kind of the business development phase. We do have a questionnaire on lessons learned, typical things. What went well, what went wrong, what do you think should have changed? So that's the first phase. Now we win, and that's fun. So what do we do when we have to initiate a contract? Usually the first thing is you go to sign the contract. Oftentimes, BIM coordinators are nowhere to be found, hence the introduction of the IBC BIM contract appendix. So I'm working with my firm to say, hey, this has to be at the very least considered, but should be included in the contracts. So we have contract templates and checklists and things that we have. If you end up working for an organization that doesn't have those, there's industry standard for architects, for engineers, contractors. So there's in Canada, it's the RAIC, and then the local provincial associations, the CCDC, which are the contractor ones. So there's a whole host out there. So objectives of the contract, and this is what we talked about last week a bit. The rights and obligations of each party, what services are to be provided, and how we're to do it, and then appropriation of risk. Now, those first three bullets I think are very important, because this is where the BIM contract appendix kind of feeds in. What do we have to do? What are we going to do? And what rights do we all have? The contract appendix adds on to that. What are we modeling? Who's going to do it? And what rights do we have to share that model? Very important. And then we sign off and we ensure everybody is in agreement. Now we get a successful reply. We mobilize the team, establish those budgets. BIM coordinators need to be there to ensure that what was thought about in the business development is now realized and made live. This is what we're BIMing. This is why we're BIMing it. This is how I'm going to make an execution plan. This is the budget I need for the duration of the project. And then you get to see who's on the team and augment accordingly. The work plan includes the BIM execution plan. Hold back some, now again, because we're global students, I'm not exactly sure if this applies everywhere, but usually there's a 10% holdback that's done in Ontario and possibly in other jurisdictions around North America. Won't dwell on that, but it's kind of like a protection for those who are making the payments. So then the planning stage. So we've initiated the project. Now you're going to get things going. So first we ensure that all parties are signed, all documents are in place. Then we kick off. Kickoff meetings. How important. No project should start from a BIM/CAD/technology perspective without some sort of meeting of everybody sitting down saying, this is how we're going to do it. So important when it's internal, extreme. The project planning, scope, objectives for your teams, right? Scope, very important. BIM scope, scope, schedule, budget. You need a scope. I can't stress this any harder. The BIM execution plan has contact information as well. So oftentimes I say, BIM doesn't happen outside of project delivery. If there's already been a charter and a team set, the BIM execution plan just references what else is happening in project delivery. Kickoff. Ensure everyone has an understanding of the project, its parameters, and their roles. And then present scope, schedule, budget. For me, this is it. This is everything. This is the BIM coordinator taking everything we've learned. What are our BIM uses? How are they going to help to achieve the goals? What are those actual goals? How do they meet the client requirements that have been defined through the EIR or whatever document? Software, collaboration, deliverable needs, all here. This is it. This is what we present when we charter a project. If we don't do this, it's basically laying the foundation for failure. And it could be catastrophic failure. It could just be annoying mini failures, still failure. Remember that. Successful PM must also be a great communicator. BIM managers or BIM coordinators are a subset of project managers. You're managing the BIM aspects on a project. Therefore, you must be a good communicator as well. I was not. When I was in high school, I could not speak if my life depended on it. Something you learn over time, you build with confidence. That's why the last 2 weeks of this course, it's about presenting a BIM execution plan as a group, working as a group together to figure something out and then presenting it to the rest of us. So important, communication. And then not only one directional, but multi-directional communication, making sure everybody gets the message at the right time, making sure you're hearing, making sure the team is engaged and motivated, basically making sure you're all on the same page, okay? You have to convey what you need to convey, but you have to make sure everybody understands their role, make sure they all feel a part of the whole process. And remember, BIM is but a facet of an entire project, and it doesn't work in isolation. Therefore, when you're talking to architects and engineers and cost estimators and surveyors and contractors and sub-trades and whoever you're talking, clients and owners and operators, their piece of the BIM world is but a facet of everything else they do. So they've got to be motivated, involved, and communicate together in order to achieve as a whole in unison what we're trying to achieve in the BIM side, while not detrimenting what they actually have to achieve for everything else they have to do. Continual communication, charter, progress. Are we achieving what we set to achieve? Are our models talking together? Are we geo-coordinated? Are we interoperable? Are we sharing globally? Are we meeting the deliverable deadlines? Are we following the protocols? If we're not, how do we communicate that through status updates? How do we ensure people are listening, adapting, and responding, and just functioning as a collective virtual whole, which is what the empowerment of this technology is supposed to achieve. Very important. Understand who's talking to whom and how. The BIM execution plan has a portion very similar to this. So they're telling PMs to do this as a whole. As a subset, we do it BIM focused. What are we quality checking? How are we communicating? What are our meetings? Who are our attendees? How are they happening? Execution. Make this stuff happen, right? We have the various work stages. So we talked about the phases of project delivery, project definition, schematic design, design development, construction documentation. Those are on the design side. So obviously, business development is really in the project definitions initiation phase. Then schematic design is the startup and the first phase. Now here we are, design development, contract document, construction admin, and then everything leading into operations. So think of that whole phase of project delivery. Project definition, schematic, DD and CD, basically 0 to 100, construct, operate. It's all here. Depending on the mode of contract delivery, design bid, design build, P3, integrated project delivery, you may be touching all those stages, maybe just one design stage. Either way, it's a scaled approach. Fundamentally, everything applies. We're producing something, we're invoicing, we're resolving issues and collecting cash. Whether you're doing it at the macro or the micro level, reviewing documents, reviewing each other's work, definitely on the BIM side, right? Reviewing models, reviewing the outputs, ensuring the deliverables are being met, quality reviewing everything. and a huge aspect of the BIM coordinator is quality control of the data. If the fundamental data in that model is being done correctly, the outputs will be achieved, period. And we'll talk about that in a couple weeks when we look at those BIM use workflow diagrams. There's always the elements of the review: scope, schedule, budget. This triangle is of the utmost importance. If it's not, and this is from the Project Management Institute, if any one of those vertices are out of whack, the triangle fails. If you're focusing on too much quality, the triangle explodes. Not enough quality, the triangle implodes. I love this diagram. If there's one big takeaway from this entire course, it's probably this: BIM is tied to project management, and this is the fundamentals right here. If this doesn't work, project management fails, period. Cash flow, something that often gets lost. The BIM coordinator will play a role. If you do have a defined task, you have to say what's been completed. You have to ensure that your hours are logged, whether you have a timesheet system, manual, automatic, whatever. Every piece plays a role, and you have to understand if you've gone over your budget, then you're potentially not being paid for the work that you're instigating, and ensure there's an understanding about what that actually means. Okay? Very important. Earned value compares the planned amount of work with what's actually being done. Okay? So when you're on schedule, on budget, and your work is accomplished, it's earned. It's good. If you're over or under, it understands and identifies that. So that's something, I won't get into the particulars of these terms there, but that's something that we do talk about a lot. So monitoring performance is critical, again, with scope, your budget, managing risk, make sure your invoices are going out if you're accountable for that, or you're feeding those who need the information and you have the right resources. And the invoice one is interesting because oftentimes you're asked, so what did you do? I have to invoice the client. I have BIM coordinator. The client wants descriptions. So then you have to start to add descriptions of your work. So scope management. If there is a change, and this is where as an industry we are horrible. If there is a change in scope, request documentation, assess the impacts, communicate there's an issue, and don't do the change until you have sign off to do it. Sign off should come with an adjusted schedule or budget. Think of the triangle. Minor deviations of the triangle is probably okay, and that's a subjective opinion on what's minor. But if there's a change in scope, if you don't change something else, the triangle is going to explode. It'll just degrade. Very important. From a BIM management, if you have the IBC contract appendix, you know what you're BIMing and why you're BIMing it. If you finally got to the point with an execution plan, you have the outline of what's being done. Any changes thereafter is a change, and it's got to be accounted for. Managing your resources. Do you have the right people on the project to complete the BIM mission? Obviously, this is talking about the whole project. What else? There's an in-depth component. So let's say we have a Revit model. We're doing a hospital. We have to model all of the assets and the internal furniture and fixtures so they can be tied to an asset database and create room data sheets using a tool like Rufus or Codebook. Awesome. Does anybody know how to do that? If not, bit of a resource problem there, right? Invoice management. Reviewing budget. That's an important one. Sometimes you have to review an invoice, so don't worry about the follow-up. Usually a project accountant does this. From a BIM coordination perspective, we're about to invoice your hours. Does this make sense? Did you do these hours? Can you provide a description? Maybe we need a description by hour. Maybe we need an overall description to attach to the invoice so that we get paid. So be cognizant of what you're sending to as documentation in order to support the financial side of the project. Risk management. This is like riddles in the BIM world. Is it risky? Do we give them models? Do we give them data? How do I mitigate my risk? How do I ensure I'm not being sued or give an implied duty of care for the information? How do I ensure that my data is accurate, valid, truthful, honest, et cetera, et cetera? What makes a risk? from a BIM world, technology world, how do I mitigate it? How do I build a comfort level? How do I achieve or move towards that world of data as open, accessible, perpetually connected to this enhanced virtual digital environment? We'll get there, but we've got to manage this risk piece. Finally, budget. How much are you spending in order to do what you're doing, and how does that relate against what you estimated at the beginning of the project? Okay, actual versus planned. We thought the management of BIM would cost X. In reality, it costs Y. You manage the difference, you communicate the differential, you're fine. But keep that dialogue open. Change orders and scope creep. As sure as I'm sitting here, you'll be on a project, you'll think you have it all understood, and a little more creeps in. Oh, hey, can you just give this to the contractor? Can you just give this to the client? I know we didn't promise it, but we want to have a good relationship, so just do it. I've heard that a lot. I said yes to the client because we have other stuff we're trying to do, so let's just go do this BIM thing. Just understand, this is a change. It may be an unpaid change, may require a bit of time, may require overtime. Make sure everything is documented so when we go back and analyze the efforts, we can see what's happened and we get it. That's all. There will be change. And that's just the nature of the industry today, and I don't really see that going away. Even in an integrated project delivery project where we're all sharing profit and we're all sharing risk, there's a change there. So it's a little different because it's not singular contracts, but you're going to have to raise it to the owner, contractor, consultant, etc., saying, hey, look, if we increase this scope, we're going to have to do these additional things. Is that okay? Because we'll be collectively eating away at our profit. Do we all agree with that? Valid question, right? We have to ask those questions to gain those answers. If it leads to contract modifications, that's fine. And also understand, switching form here, especially during construction, if we're managing the BIM project, if we're managing the BIM aspects of the project during construction, the contract is perpetually changing due to changes in scope, unforeseen conditions. Most of these items listed here, instructions, change requests, change notices, change directives specifically, cause tangible changes in schedule or budget relative to the new or augmented scope that may or may not include a BIM component. And one of the hardest things in the BIM industry today is oftentimes we set our BIM goals to be too design focused. And then there's the poor owner sitting there saying, I want something as built, and we have that gap between design and constructed, so the whole construction phase, where data gets lost or is not updated. That's where all these changes happen, and all of a sudden the model from design completion is not representative of what's being built. So there's been a whole new focus on ensuring that the model is further during construction through ownership by the contractor to move towards that LOD 400 realm, and then the BIM coordinators for contractors are often the ones involved in mitigating this. A lot of fun, a lot of excitement, so keep that in mind. And then finally, to close, the closeout of a project. This is an interesting one. Just that first one, client acceptance. Now that means a lot of things in the whole realm of project delivery. Think about it from the BIM perspective. Week 2, client requirements. The client expects whatever for a deliverable. Well, now upon project completion, we're giving them that deliverable. Does it meet their needs? Does it have all the assets they're interested in? Is it the right file format? Does it have the right content, et cetera, et cetera? That's probably one of the biggest pieces when I look in this whole list that affects us. Does the client accept the turnover? Now, hopefully, in the BIM world, once we understand client requirements, we're testing that turnover throughout the life cycle of the project. That's right at the beginning, making sure that we're the right versions, the right software format, the right data taxonomy or data structure, the components are there, and hopefully that dialogue is in place from the very beginning. We have a closeout form to help support the close and lesson learned of a project. So many phases, monitor budget, scope, resources, invoices, risks, etc. Infuse it back to the world of the BIM coordinator to understand how we're executing a project, why, owner's requirements, our assessments, plan the execution plan, augment that execution plan to reflect potential changes in scope or changes in approaches, changes in workflow, workflow use diagrams, etc. Know what we're modeling, LOD matrix, who's modeling what and when, and how developed will it be at the different phases of the project, schematic or 30, 60, 90, so the design phase, in construction, into operations. Plan your BIM, don't avoid the planning of it, and while planning the BIM, do not discount the importance of the infusion of the BIM planning process into the overall project management process, or else it will be set to fail no matter how well your intentions are. And that helps us to lead to this concept I showed in previous weeks. If we're planning and we understand who's doing what, and we've mitigated risk and we've tied it back to contracts, and we have all of our parties talking to each other, we know what to deliver to whom and when and how we're collaborating and sharing, we can hit this realm of a virtually connected synergistic data realm where what we're designing infuses into the real world, allowing for full data synergy throughout not only the life cycle of the project, but extended beyond into the life cycle of the assets we've designed as they interrelate to smart cities, advanced Internet of Things, and everything down the road. So that's my spiel. That's my presentation for this week. Again, it was project delivery and its overall infusion into the BIM world. So let me minimize that. So going back to the week, the other thing I wanted to touch upon briefly was the limit of liability. So in the last 2 weeks, again, we talked about the excitement of all the things we could do. I did bring up this IBC contract appendix, which I'll quickly bring up again. And we've talked about, why? What is the fear? All the stuff I just talked about, even in the last 10 weeks. What is the fear of actually doing it? Why are people scared? And that's a beautiful thing. So one big fear alleviation is this contract appendix, putting into writing, addressing issues of copyright and risk. What's the modeling scope? Who's doing what? Authorized uses for the models. Why we're modeling, why the parties privy to these contracts are modeling, who we're going to be delivering these models to, and what they may use it for, etc., in a contract. But even that, the fear of tort, the fear of will it be expected for a duty of care on my end relative to the information I give out. So with that, we looked at a limit of liability, which is this document here. Now, there could be various examples of this. This is by no means the only possible version of it. But the limit of liability agreement is something that IBI has said, all right, we're going to do this every single time we hand out something digital. And I alluded to this last week. So the concept here is, I'm going to give you something, and it's outside of what I'm contracted to give you. So simple example, I'm contracted to make drawings and specs. The drawings are going to come from my model. I have a model. I work for IBI. IBI talks about BIM. We know there's a model back there. We want the model. We're not contracted to give you the model, even though our deliverables come from the model. So, duty of care. There's contract law and tort law. Duty of care, architects and engineers. If I give you the model, am I liable for stuff you find in the model? Am I liable for what you do with the model that may be above and beyond what I built the model for? Very fair question. My simple response to everybody, give anything digital, attach this. It's no different than when we gave DWGs. So we've all gotten beyond, I give you an AutoCAD file, and I remember, goodness, 30 years ago, what if they take my blocks? What if they take my layers? Nobody cares anymore. In the BIM world, what if they pull out my Revit family? Don't care anymore. Give the digital data. More important is, what if they do something with the model and they try to hold me liable? I care about that. I do not want to be held liable. So this agreement basically says the recipient, so it's binding between us and a recipient for a specific project. The recipient has the right to use the model for these specific reasons. And usually we'll check this as background, usually. We can add other items. So imagine in here I said, to take quantities and rely specifically on the output to be perfect. I would never do that. But a contractor would love for me to put that in here, because that means my model has been 100% designed in order to facilitate quantities. Now, even as a side note, I forgot to say, this doesn't apply just to design bid. We also attach this to design build, because even in a design build relationship, I may be developing a model just for sole purposes. And I'll say, look, here it is. Take it, understand why I'm giving you this model. You may be my client, you may be my sub, you may be a third-party stakeholder. This is all that I've made the model for, and this is what I'm essentially certifying it for. And usually it's background information. And then it goes into saying it can't be handed off to other people, and then it starts to outline the limits. If it's used for any other purpose, we do not warrant or guarantee the accuracy, correctness, completeness of the model, blah, 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 blah. This helps to alleviate that fear. We retain all the rights for our model because it's a static snapshot of our thing. Do whatever you want with it. Our model at this static snapshot is still our model. And the recipient assumes all the rights, all the risks, all et cetera, to do whatever they want with the model itself. And then if they breach the terms, there's some consequences, etc. Very simple, quote, simple form that we stress to be attached with every single digital BIM deliverable. No different than you going to a website and you have to check the user acceptance, right? You read through all those clauses. Some of them are pretty scary. If you actually read them, you accept it anyway because you want to use the website. Same thing here. If somebody comes back and says, oh, no, we want your model, but we want you to be 100% liable for everything that you have inside that model, well, that could be a problem. And we would definitely entertain into that dialogue. Most likely we wouldn't be turning over the digital information. And then usually what we do is we include a schedule of what is included. So what is this instance of the limit of liability attached to? So Revit model A, B, C, Civil 3D model D, E, F, etc. This is it, packaged, delivered through whatever collaborative means that are there. Usually we track the submission and everything is good. So conceptually, that's why I wanted to close this legal aspects with this. I want, as BIM coordinators, I want us to all understand there is a fear, a legal fear, fear of negligence, fear of liability, whatever you want to call it. There is a fear in this world of connected digital data that I will be held accountable for stuff professionally that I'm not meant to be accountable for, or under an inappropriate use of a duty of care. Therefore, BIM coordinators be cognizant of architects and engineers and what their professional limits are, what they're usually accountable for, and be cognizant of forms like this limit of liability that says, all right, we're going to share information. We still want to protect the parties, especially in the world of the contractual arrangements like what we have today. In the world of IDP, I would sense that, maybe in this world, limit of liabilities may not be required, quite simply because we're all entered into agreement where we're mitigating and sharing risk. So if I give a model to a contractor or an owner or an engineer, we're all in the same IDP contractor, essentially in the same legal entity or virtual entity, if you will. we're not going to have that issue. But in this world here, because it's either contractual arrangements or cascading contractual arrangements, want to make sure that digital turnover is understood as to why things are being turned over. And with that, that brings an end to week number 10. So there are no new assignments or no new tests for this week, but I just want to again remind everybody that the week 9 quiz is open and available for to be done. So at your earliest convenience, please come in and do the week 9 quiz. Also, the assignment for week 8 is now, it has been open. So definitely this is working at defining a technical solution. Again, with the work stoppage, there are no fixed deadlines on any of these, but they are open. And I will update the announcement with the week 10 recording, as well as a reminder of the links as I did in the week 9. Thank you for your attendance. I hope you enjoyed this, and we will talk next week. Have a good day.